began Daniel last week, Daniel chapter 1, and we just kind of went into a couple of things. And listen, while I'm going over this, I'll kind of recap. But if there is a specific place that you wanted me to go in a little bit more depth, please let me know. So we talked about right away in Daniel chapter 1, and there are Daniel books up here, but in Daniel chapter 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. And so the idea I started off right away with was, who is Jehoiakim? We don't really hear a lot about him necessarily, but who is he? Well, according to the Babylonians, and then I went into the timing of what when it says 3rd year here, 1st year there. But who is he? 609 to 597 BC. He was the second of the sons, if you will, of King Joash. And by the way, he was nothing like his father. Joash was a great and godly man. Joash came to the throne, if you remember, at the age of 8. But he has a proxy, or he has a person working with him, until he's able to do it on his own. But it's Josiah, by the way, that actually finds the book of the law. Remember, the book of the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, have not been read in years. A generation is completely lost who God is. That happens that fast. And so when Joash hears about this book that they found as they were cleaning out the temple, he has it read. Joash is brokenhearted because he knows that they're not doing what God has called them to do. So that's who Joash is. But Jehoiakim, by the way, is nothing like his dad. He is actually evil. And he's even, some say, even worse and more evil, more oppressive than his grandfather, Ammon, as well as Manasseh. And if anybody has ever read anything about Manasseh, that man was flat out evil. Joash, by the way, was extremely godly, loved the Lord, served the Lord. However, he is killed by Necho, which is...
You're saying Joash, but up there you have Josiah.
I'm sorry, I mean Josiah.
Okay,
yeah.
All right.
It's like in Western thought, I'm talking about a martyr named Patrick Hamilton, and I keep saying Patrick Henry. So yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is Josiah. Right. Josiah. I'm sorry. So he is killed by Pharaoh Necho from Egypt, of course, in battle. And so this is, by the way, the Assyrian Empire, which we're talking about. You can kind of see Assyria. It began as the dark green, and then the light green is what it finally is after it expands out. So it's quite the distance, quite the landmass that the Assyrian Empire is. But the Israelites hate the Assyrians hate the Israelites. But that's the Assyrian Empire at its peak. But at the Battle of Carchemish is where the Assyrian Empire ceases to exist. Because Babylon, which you can see if you follow the dotted line all the way over, and Babylon, which was just a city at that time, begins to move. Nebuchadnezzar moves forward, gets into the area of Carchemish, which is at the very top of the big dot. And the Battle of Carchemish is where Pharaoh Necho, as well as the Assyrian leaders, as well as Babylon, they all meet. And actually Babylon is the one that defeats everybody at Carchemish. And then he begins moving south, conquering as he is moving south, as Necho runs all the way back to Egypt. But here's the thing that we need to keep in mind, and maybe I've got it over here. Okay, the Assyrian capital is located in a place called Nineveh, and I know last week we talked about this because that name Nineveh should sound familiar. Nineveh is the place that Jonah is told to go. He does not want to go. He gets on a boat, and he's heading actually for Joppa, but now we're talking about all the way across over into Spain. The complete opposite, the farthest direction. That's the reason why it sounds familiar. But why was that? Why was there frustration that the Israelites hated the Assyrian people? Because they had always been against Israel, constantly aggravating them, harassing them, attacking and going back. Jonah did not want God to show mercy to these people. He would rather have them destroyed. But Assyria, by the way, were trying to save their empire at Carchemish. They were trying to save it. They knew the Babylonians, and so they called in the Egyptians to actually support them. And of course, this is even more the reason why Nebuchadnezzar wanted to stop them there, because he didn't want Egypt involved anywhere in the area. And Egypt has to pass through Judah. Josiah, at that time then, goes out to stop the Egyptians because he doesn't want the Assyrians to succeed. And that takes us over here. So when Josiah actually hears about the Egyptians moving on the north-south road, remember, the major trade routes go through Israel. North, south, east, west. Major trade routes. And, of course, Israel has tremendous port towns. So a lot of trade goes through there, and everybody wants to control that area because of that. So when Josiah hears that the Egyptians are coming, to actually aid the Assyrians. He goes out to meet them in battle because he does not want anybody to aid the Assyrians. He wants them to die. He wants them to come to an end. The two armies meet in the plain of Megiddo. Now, does Megiddo sound familiar? Yeah, exactly right. As a matter of fact, we talk about in Revelation the Battle of Armageddon, which, by the way, is a mistranslation. It actually is Har Megiddo, is what that word. And by the way, Har Megiddo is the mountain of Megiddo. And it's not really a mountain, it's more of a tell. And the difference between a mountain and a tell, a mountain is a natural thing. A tell is just one community was here, it turned to ruins, they built on top of that community, and they keep building on top, and finally makes this hill or mound. That's what a tell is. So it's constant civilizations building on top of each other. And that's what it is. So a Har Megiddo is actually the area of Megiddo, but the plain is wide open. And so they meet in the plain of Megiddo, and Josiah is mortally wounded. And once he is wounded, he says, "Take me back to Jerusalem that I may be buried with my fathers," because he knew he was going to die. And the people of Judah, by the way, at that time make Jehoahaz, the oldest son of Josiah, they make him king. But Necho removes him because Necho is coming through. Now that Josiah is gone and dead, he removes him from being them and puts Jehoiakim in. Now, why does he put Jehoiakim there? Now, he takes Jehoahaz back as a prisoner, and we don't hear about Jehoahaz after that anymore. But he puts Jehoiakim in because Jehoiakim has sworn allegiance to him. Now, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know this, but he has sworn allegiance. And by the way, you can read all this in 2 Chronicles chapters 33 through 35. But here's where it happens. So the king of Babylon that attacks, we know is Nebuchadnezzar. But it's actually not Nebuchadnezzar who actually takes over. He attacks, yes, and they become victorious. But it's not because Nebuchadnezzar is a great strategist. It's not anything like that at all. It's the fact that the Bible is very clear. It says the Lord, and the word used there, by the way, is Adonai. Adonai, which means Lord and owner, which is important for us to understand. He is the one that actually gives them victory, meaning the Babylonians, because God gives them over. Because here's the deal. When people rebel against God for so long, God eventually says, "I'm just going to remove my hand of protection. You're on your own." And then here's what's going to happen. You're either going to wake up and turn back to me, or you'll remain in your position, and you'll remain in destitute, exile, whatever the case it may be, captivity. And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't come in and win because he's great and everything else. The Lord actually gives Judah over. And so after Nebuchadnezzar wins at Carchemish, he sweeps down the coastline into the valley. He takes Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim swears allegiance again, as we talked about, to Egypt, and eventually dies in disgrace. I'm going to go a little more in detail about that, because last week, this was our last slide. So I'm going to go a little bit more in detail about this whole time between Nebuchadnezzar and and what takes place with Egypt. So when he dies in disgrace, he is thrown out as a donkey. He's put into the trash heap. He's not given a proper burial. In other words, he just simply laid out in the exposure and burned with all the rest of the stuff. But here's where I wanted to go ahead and get into it. So how evil and arrogant was Jehoiakim? Because it is important that we understand this. Well, the fact is, when Jehoiakim hears about Jeremiah writing prophecies that the Lord was given about the land of Israel and its evil and what was going on, he actually has the prophecies of Jeremiah brought to him. And when they're brought to him, he wants them read. And so Jehoiakim actually sits on his throne. By the way, you can find this in Jeremiah 36. He sits on the throne and he listens. And after about 4 or 5 things are read, he's so infuriated that he takes a knife and cuts the scroll, takes that piece and drops it in the fire, and then says, "Proceed. Keep reading." And so as they would read, he would cut the piece off and burn it. Cut the piece off and burn it. And so, by the way, everything was gone. In other words, he lived in complete defiance to who the Lord was, even to the point of speaking out against God. Now, by the way, it doesn't say this in Scripture, but it is written in history. It is written in history that, I'm talking about Josephus who writes about it, that it's because there are other books of history that were written outside of Scripture by the Jews. It is written that Jehoiakim was so evil that Jehoiakim said that his predecessors, his grandfather and his grandfather, a great-grandfather, that they weren't evil enough. that they didn't know how to really anger God, but he did. He knew how to anger God. And so he was really proud of this. There's an arrogance about him. I mean, an arrogance beyond the word arrogance. That's who Jehoiakim was. This infuriation. And the reason why is because he really thought he had everything under control. But needless to say, and after this I'm going to stop to see if there's any questions, the Lord will not be mocked in any way, shape, or form. And that's the reason why the Lord tells Jeremiah to write what he does in Jeremiah 36, verses 30 through 31, that Jehoiakim, by the way, eventually meets the Lord face to face. Now, this is what I want to take a second to stop and just have us think about. Jehoiakim, who cuts the prophecies, cuts the scroll of the prophecies that God gives Jeremiah and burns them. And if he did really say that, and I don't see any reason why not, he had the arrogance to be able to do so, that if he really burns these and says, oh, listen, nobody knows how to make God angry as much as me. I'm the one that's best at that. Almost like it was like a trophy to have. We know he lives evil and it was detestable to God. We know all that. But imagine what it must have been like when his life does end and he stands face to face with the very one he mocked. Now, I know that, by the way, this applies to even us today. Because every single person will bow and will claim that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior. I know Jehoiakim at this time had no idea who Jesus was per se, but the idea is every one of us will meet our Maker. And when you stand before your Maker, imagine the great arrogance you lived with, and now you have to answer. I could not imagine what it must have been like. So before I go any further, so now what questions or comments do you have?
It reminds me of that kid who went to court and they let him off because of
the affluenza.
affluenza.
Oh, because he was rich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, do you think that that's part of it?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think if you're raised in royalty, there probably is an idea of entitlement and things like that. But I don't know if that's as much like the entitlement part. I don't know if that's as much the problem as this arrogance of I can do anything I want and nobody can tell me what to do. By the way, the same arrogance, and now we can go one step further. Some areas you read about Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim did not want to look Jewish, so even his clothing was not the normal robe that a Jewish king wore. It looked more like the Persians. And some even say, and I think I'm using this word or saying the word correctly, because I didn't realize it was a real thing until I investigated it to find out, but that Jehoiakim actually had, and I think it's called epispasm done. Anybody in here, a medical field, know about that word? Because I investigated that word, and that is actually where we're all adults in here, so I'm going to go ahead and share it with you guys. That he was so detested being and looking like a Jew that this thing called, I think it's called the epispasm, actually is where they take skin in a male area and re-stretch it so that it looks like a new foreskin. Because circumcision would have removed that. And that was the sign of a Jewish male. And he even went through this procedure to try to not look male. Or, not look like a Jewish male. Not look male like today's society. But I'm talking about, but not look like a Jewish male, one that was circumcised. Now, once again, that's written in secular history, so I don't know if that's true or not. But if you had this kind of arrogance, I could see, if you've sworn allegiance to the Egyptians, I could see, possibly, but once again, that is not biblical, so we don't find that scripturally. So I don't know if that, I know it was a lengthy answer, but there was, I don't know if it was as much affluence as it was, while that could have played part of it, but there is a real arrogance that people have. Richard Dawkins today has such an arrogance about what he believes about who God, there is no God, but how stupid you are to believe in God, that he has this bold arrogance to say very distasteful things that one day, like Jehoiakim, he will stand before his Maker and have to answer for it. And you know what? As much as I really do not like Richard Dawkins, and I hate the things he says, I pity the man when he stands before God. I really do. I hope he wakes up prior to that time, but if not, he's going to stand before the one he mocked. He's going to stand before the one that he has done all this to, and have to answer for it. Yes.
I've always thought it was interesting how the Kings, and I don't think this is limited to just Kings, how you can have an evil grandfather, an evil great grandfather, and then have a good father, and then be evil. Like I don't know. It seems that's always. I guess before I had kids, I always thought, well, what did the fathers do that made their kid evil?
Right.
And now I don't really think that because that scares me to death. But it's just kind of interesting to me how, and you look in today, you can look how a family can have two boys and one turn out one way and one turn out a dope head in prison.
Right.
Or should be in prison. Not that I'm thinking of anybody specific. But yeah. But at some point, people have to make their own decision.
Sure.
You know, and maybe it comes to being raised in a loyal. No one wants to tell you no, even from an early age. I don't know. I mean, I know that's way off topic, but I just always thought that.
Well, I don't think it is all that far. I think that goes back to the worldview idea here, because here is truth. And by the way, this is proven psychologically that you can have two children and they're raised by the same parents, the same morals, the same standards, the same everything, but who their sphere of influence was is what changes how they did. So I mean, we see this happen all the time. So if I got mixed in with the wrong crowd, that's how we say it today. Well, so-and-so just got mixed in with the wrong crowd, and they wound up in a really bad place, but the other person stayed away from the wrong crowd and continued. Both standards, both kids had the same parents, same standards. The difference was their sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence, the things I allow to speak into my life, whether it's people, whether it's music, whether it's literature, or whether it's movies, whatever the case it may be, that actually sets my worldview. And if I'm not careful about the fact that everything, and listen, this isn't meant to scare anybody, but this is true. Everything we listen to, every advertisement we see, every book we read, every song that is played, everything out there, every movie has a worldview they're trying to impress upon you. And if we are not careful, if we get really nonchalant and tell our kids they can listen to any music they want, they can read any book they want, they can watch any movie they want without parental people being there to explain stuff, and they can do all these things they want while they're young. Remember, the brain doesn't stop forming until 25. But especially all the way up to about the age of 18 or 19, it's so pliable and it's so impressive to be impressed upon that you can have the same standards that you had for everybody else, but one's going to go astray because they're being influenced in a different way. And it will change. The thing speaking into my life will change who I am. And it changes me, by the way, all the way down to my DNA. So, and all I need is for my thinking can actually change my DNA. Men, in our men's retreat 3 years ago, when we did the thing on pornography, if you remember, that has actually been proven medically, neurologically, it's been proven that when a person's thinking starts changing and starts focusing on one thing, it literally changes the DNA for the next generation. If we're not careful, the good thing is we can change it back. But it can change the DNA, and all of a sudden now our family goes from really good Josiah to Jehoiakim, if something's wrong. Yes, I think you're. Was your hand up first? Okay.
I said, is that why chivalry's dead?
Huh?
Is that why chivalry's dead?
Exactly why.
That's exactly why. Because we have a world emasculating men. We have books actually promoting the emasculation of men, and we actually even have men who don't even know if they're men anymore. And so, absolutely, that's the reason why chivalry's dead, because there's nobody actually emulating chivalry. And the few that do, everybody loves them. Yes, ma'am. And then I'll come over here.
I agree with all of that, except for one thing. While there are other influences out there, parents, especially in the formative years, parents are the guardians to make sure what's influencing your children. But even when they get out, you may not see your influence until years and years and years later.
Mhm.
But that's not to dismiss the parents still have, and I believe, I don't know, psychology, but I've heard it way back when sometime. It's just one of those things that stuck in my head. Parents are the most influential over all the other influences that are out there. And kids absorb that. And they may not be conscious of it, but, I mean, you hear stories, I'm 48 years old, I'm still hearing my mother and father's voice in my head, when it comes to a decision.
And listen.
And you're not hearing,
Mhm.
whatever else's influence.
And I will not disagree with that, but what we have to also understand is that in this world, there is a real spiritual battle going on, and if the influence around your kids speak louder than the influence of the parents, the influence that's louder will win. Now, here's this. So 1 to 14, you've heard me talk about this before. 1 to 14, birth to 14 is the foundational years. That's the years that you have to speak absolute life and truth into your kids. That's foundational. But right around the age of 15, 16, they begin to get into the formative years. Formative years goes around the age of 15 or 16 to about 25. And so there's a period of time. So now that mom and dad has reared them, now that mom and dad has taught them, they are now trying to find out how they fit into the world. And that is the most devastating time, especially if you've not laid the foundation. Because in those formative years, remember, to them, you're not the authority anymore. The authority is my friend. The authority is my teacher. The authority is my professor. And that authority all of a sudden will make me go back to my foundation and say, that was wrong, and this person I've known for about 3 months is right. Which is sad, but that's what happens. But we've got to lay the foundation, but the formative things is when we really need to speak in. And it goes back to the fact that while the parents are very influential, the best thing we could ever do, and I know everybody knows this, but during the foundational years is to be dead on, spot on, and truth. But in the formative years is pray our bottoms off. Because that's the only thing, because you and I cannot be there 24/7. And so we pray that God will protect them and help them and have them turn back whenever there's a need and a help and so on and so forth. And here's the deal. Some do and some don't. Let me come over here because she had her hand up for a while.
I work with middle schoolers, and it amazes me how many false gods are out there. And one of the things that I do with the kids is, I tell them, we each get $50,000, and you get a choice of buying a $40,000 Mercedes-Benz or a $4,000 Hyundai Accent. Almost every single one of them says they'll take the Mercedes-Benz. My next question is, we both live in the same apartment complex. We both walk out of our house at the same time. We both get into our car. We both start the car. We both leave the parking lot. We both come to school. Who wins? And they're like, what are you talking about? And it's like, well, who gets there first? And they're like, I don't know. We get there at the same time. It's like, you're right. Who's richer? And then they all go, and it's like I put the math up on the board. And I'll say, I still have $46,000, but you only have $10,000. Who's richer? And they're like, but I look richer. And that's what they care about. It's like, how can you be that backwards? What are you going to eat? How are you going to pay your rent?
It's called Common Core.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
You are absolutely right.
Yes, ma'am.
With what we were talking about as well, Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, and look how different things turned out raised by the same parents.
Absolutely.
So it's like the free will that starts.
It is. It's exactly what it comes down to. To freely choose something right or wrong. Yes, and then I'll come up. Yes.
I wanted to say, in response to what Karen said, if parents were doing the racing, that would be one thing. But the typical child is 3 months old when daycare takes over.
Right.
And
That's a good point.
the role models are peers, and the daycares are run by government standards. So they're getting all the same garbage that they're getting in the public schools. So we really don't have that foundational time with these kids.
What was the most recent commercial? And it was for a food product, believe it or not. but it says that statistics now show that we have 38 minutes a day to have family time. 38 minutes a day. Now, by the way, that was just a common commercial on television. 38 minutes. Yes, sir.
But really, like you said, it comes down to prayer. If you're looking for a godly parent, I don't think you could probably do better than King David.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Name me one of his kids who turned out well. Just one.
He didn't turn out really great. He had the right heart.
He
Yeah.
had a run.
Yeah.
But he only had a run. He didn't make it to the finish line.
Right.
But let me think. His kids tried to kill him, raped his sister, murdered his brother.
Yep.
I'm sure because he wasn't a godly parent.
Right. Exactly. Right.
So, yeah, it really doesn't come down to what you did. Not really. So you really have to pray.
And by the way, Solomon himself even says that. Yeah. And then we'll move on. Go ahead.
I mean, like, I always try to separate things, like, before Christ, after Christ. Like, I always put that into that was before Christ, and I just kind of figured that they had the rock furniture and, you know, all that kind of stuff.
It wasn't a Flintstone.
Yeah, that was the Flintstone.
We talked about it that one time.
Yeah.
We just automatically assumed that they were cavemen. That
Right.
they were cavemen, you know what I mean?
Right.
And like after Christ, it's like, how could you be that stupid? Because now you have Christ, he showed you the way.
Right.
But they really had him all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely right.
But just need to address that for just a second, because the old world wasn't that primitive.
No, at all. No. As a matter of fact, our intelligence has decreased from Adam to now. We are just dumber. And I'm not trying to put us down.
It's true.
But here's the deal. Adam and Eve are created perfect. That means they're using 100% of their brain. A genius today, quote unquote, uses around 15. Who was the smarter person? Adam and Eve. And we've gotten dumber since. Now we think we're so much smarter, but we've gotten really... I'll leave that there.
And our knowledge has increased, which is why we're in the pickle we're in.
That's exactly right.
More knowledge,
Yeah.
less intelligence.
Educated idiots. Yeah. Babylon, by the way, allowed Jehoiakim to be king. Now, this is the part that I really want to make sure that we understand. So Babylon had already controlled the area. Remember, Necho was out, Battle Carchemish, Necho goes through. Then when Babylon comes through and conquers it, Nebuchadnezzar allows Jehoiakim to keep it. Why? It's a stability in the area. You report to me, you pay tribute to me, but we'll allow you to be the king because you're a king of these people. They know you. We're going to allow you to be the king. But Jehoiakim gives that allegiance to Egypt, which, by the way, Babylon doesn't like Egypt. And when they find out that this happens in 601 BC, they come back and invade again, meaning Nebuchadnezzar invades again. So that happens 601 BC is when Jehoiakim swears allegiance, or it becomes known, I should say, which destabilizes controlling the entire area. King Nebuchadnezzar invades again, and ends Jehoiakim's rule, which is, by the way, 597 BC. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. So there's multiple stories as to how Jehoiakim dies. Some say that Nebuchadnezzar was out, he besieges the city for 3 months, cuts off everything. If it wasn't for Hezekiah's tunnel, they would have never ever had any kind of water. But besieges the city for 3 months and basically says, this is all I want. I want Jehoiakim brought to me. Well, somewhere in that 3 months, there are several stories. One is this: Jehoiakim dies. Now, I don't know if it dies by heart attack or if he dies by suicide, but he dies. And so they say he's dead. Nebuchadnezzar says, give me the body then. And they throw it over the wall. So they actually throw it over the wall to Nebuchadnezzar. It hits the ground. Nebuchadnezzar looks and says, yep, it's him. And they leave. And that's the reason why his body remains in the dung heap. And so they wanted to make sure. Then there's another story that says, which if you remember, where Jeremiah talks about the burial of a donkey. There's another historical story. Once again, not scriptural. Another historical story that Nebuchadnezzar then takes his body and stuffs it into the dead carcass of a donkey. Remember, Israelites were not allowed to be around dead carcasses. It made you unclean. and he actually stuffs it into the carcass of a dead donkey and leaves it in the trash heap. Now that would also kind of fit the prophecy in a sense. But either way it goes, he's dead, and he never ever gets taken out. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar makes sure he is dead before they actually pull out. And then, of course, when that actually happens, well, let's just go ahead and look. When you think about this story, it's actually very sad. I mean, really. Beyond the fact that he's arrogant and rude and everything else, it's really sad. But it should be a lesson to any leader in the world that believes that he can live in defiance of the Lord Almighty and get away with it. It should be, but it's not. By the way, it's not even this is not even a reminder for future kings in Israel that are going to turn against God and do all the things that they naturally do when they ebb and flow, constant going back and forth. So Nebuchadnezzar now empties the temple. He had emptied it before. Here's the things that he had taken. Not these aren't pictures of the things. But the idea of the goblet, that's what it would look like. It was a solid gold goblet, and there would have been many of these. Then there's the menorahs, what you and I call the menorahs. They were just simply called the lampstands. The menorahs, and by the way, the big base at the bottom actually held oil inside of them. And then the basins, by the way, there were various basins inside the temple. And some were brass, some were silver, some were gold. But they were all precious metals. The actual basins would have been various things. And then I want to go ahead and show you this, and hopefully you can see it. This is a picture of Solomon's temple kind of opened up on the side. And I know it's a little bit distant, but what I wanted to go ahead and show you, and I don't have a marker, or can I do my... No, I can't. Okay. All right. So if you look at the very bottom, you got this big basin with the water inside of it. And then to the left of it are 5 basins. And by the way, all these basins would have been large. Most of them were brass. But on the inside of the temple were also basins that they did the ceremonial hand cleansing. And they were smaller, and they were usually silver or gold. But there are many basins inside the temple area. All of them would have been taken because the brass and all that could have been melted down and used for swords, used for shields, and many other things. But then there's also a lot of gold inside the temple. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar sets the temple aflame by the time he leaves as well. They strip everything down that they absolutely can. So on the inside of the temple, this is kind of a generalized layout. You can see the amount of menorahs, and you can see the size of these things. The menorahs were all gold. They weren't gold overlay. They were gold. And then, of course, you see the priest standing right in front of the table of incense. Well, the table of incense, you had the table, and on top of it was a basin. And by the way, that basin was brass. It wasn't gold, because gold would have melted too easy as they were burning them. But to the right of that floor, you see these tables. And if you look to the far right, you can see a priest holding something like this. These were actually tables that stacked what they called showbread. Now, the showbread, by the way, was baked once a week. And it was put inside the temple, and it was stacked up. And the showbread was to show that God was the bread, was that which feeds us. His word feeds us. But that showbread is also, remember later on, they talk about David going into the temple and eating the showbread. And so they're talking about, but anyhow, all those tables and all that, now they would have been gold and silver. And so there's a lot of things inside there that they would have taken for that purpose. And by the way, Nebuchadnezzar does take those things. Now, here's the deal, though. Nowhere does it talk about Nebuchadnezzar taking the Ark of the Covenant. We'll talk about that later. But that's what they would have taken out of here. Now, here's the big thing that a lot of people called me about, was the names. Okay, by the way, any questions about the temples and that which was taken? Okay, here's the names, because this is what the thing was. Their Hebrew name, and then, of course, the name they were given. So you can see, starting at the very top, there's Daniel, and then, of course, what his name meant, and then there's the name that he was given, Belteshazzar, and what that name meant. And so you have that right there. I'll leave that up there for a couple of minutes while we're talking about it, because, once again, it's a reminder to you and I what they were trying to do. And we had talked about this fact, the whole purpose of the education process was to get them to lose their identity or forget their identity, put it behind them, and take on their new identity. So Daniel means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means Bel or Marduk, either one. They were kind of interchangeable, protects his life. So in other words, God's not your judge. It's actually Bel who takes care of you. He's the one who protects you. Then there's Hananiah, which means the Lord shows grace. And then he becomes Shadrach. Shadrach means command of Aku. which, as you see there, by the way, was a Sumerian moon god, but command of Aku.
So as in, Aku commands him?
Yeah, like you follow the commands of Aku. And then there's Mishael. Mishael, by the way, Mishael, which means who is what God is. In other words, he's becoming more like God. And I'm not God in the sense that he's going to rule, not that, but today you and I would say we are called to grow to be like Jesus. That's what it is. But Meshach actually means who is what Aku is. So it's just a replacing. And then there's Azariah, which means the Lord helps. Abednego, by the way. Abednego means the servant of Nego or Nebo, and even in some areas, Nebu. Now, they're all the same names. It just depends on who was saying them. But servant of. So you go from the Lord helps me to your job is to serve Nego or Nebo. And so that's what the names are. And remember, once again, these names are to change how you see yourself. And definitely change as to who you serve. So, any questions about any of those right there? Then let's go ahead and get to the parts now I believe that we had not gotten to. Well, we talked about the defiling and so on and so forth, and how they were going to, they didn't want to eat, and how eventually after the time period, they were healthier and so on and so forth. We did speak about that, but now we get to, and I think we leave off in 12? 15. Okay. So let me go ahead and let me just get a brief summary here. What did God, number 13, what did God give the young men? What was knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. So God was the one that was actually helping them become who they needed to be to serve his purpose in Babylon. 14 says, what did God give Daniel the ability to do? And we talked about to understand and interpret visions and dreams of all kinds. And by the way, this in the Persian world was called divination. Now, divination, by the way, was the practice of reaching out to gods. There's only one God that it ever works with, and that's our God. And, of course, that's the reason why Daniel could do the things that the other ones claimed to do but could not. But they called it divination. And the reason why I bring that up is because when you're reading Daniel, when you're reading about Joseph in Genesis, Joseph actually takes his cup and puts it inside of Benjamin's wheat bag, and then after they leave, he tells his servants, go out and get them, and when you find the cup, by the way, it was called Daniel's cup, or Joseph's cup of divination. And so that's what they called it, but obviously, he didn't use the cup to get his answers. It was God who did that, and that's the reason I wanted to make sure you understood what was going on there. But other than Joseph, Daniel is the only other person that's able to do this. I mean, this way. And here's where we pick up now in 15. All right, so let me go ahead and move here. All right, so 15, at the end of the time set by the king, what does the king find after talking to the 4 young men?
There were none equal.
That's exactly right. There were none equal to them. Now, by the way, we're not even talking about physical appearance anymore. That's already been determined. Remember, that was determined early on. The training process for these 4 young men was how long?
3 years.
3 years. So we're talking 3 years later, and now the king says, okay, great. They finished their training process, bring them in. I want to interview them. And when they bring them in, he finds out that not only are they above and beyond every other, as a matter of fact, the Bible says 10 times better. In other words, they exceeded every single other person, including, by the way, their current astrologers and spiritualists and everything else. These 4 guys were well above them in knowledge and in wisdom. And so, number 16, and then we can wrap them in together. So what were the 4 men assigned to do? To enter into the king's service. Now, we don't know if the rest of the other people that were being trained, we don't know if they were, but because of their knowledge, because of who they were, and because of what they had proved, they were allowed to enter into the king's service, which, by the way, is not well, let me go ahead and put you up here. So look with me real fast. There was none like them. So what we see here is the Lord allowing them the tremendous learning for the 4 young men. This is the Lord doing this for them. God grants them the wisdom to have the knowledge to not only understand what was going on, but also, remember, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And so all 4 of these young men not only grew in the knowledge, but had the wisdom to know how to apply it. And by the way, God gave them everything they would need to succeed in exile. But not only succeed, but also benefit their people while they were in exile. Because remember, every one of these guys are going to become leaders over people. And so they're able to actually protect the people of Israel. But let me go ahead and tell you what this is not. And the reason why I even bring this up is because there are theologians that write about this. What this is not, what we do not see happening here with these 4 young men, this is not these young men turning away from God and His Word. That's not what's happening here. They exceeded in knowledge and the wisdom of the Babylonians. This is not these young men turning against God, and they are not turning away from the Word. By the way, the theologians that say that, I wonder what rest of Daniel they read, because they were almost put to death several times because of this. But that's what it's not. It's also not an exceptional teaching of a great Babylonian teacher. That's not what we see happening either. Because there are people that write about the fact that Babylon at this time in history, would have been the center of education, so there were great teachers, and that's why they were able to learn. So, no, that's not it. This is a gift from God, allowing them to do that. When you create the brain, you can make it work exceptionally well. And this is also not these young men becoming Babylonian and therefore forgetting their heritage. It's not that at all. And there are theologians that debate and say that. Well, they by the end of the 70 years, they were more Babylonian than they were Israeli, or more Babylonian than they were worshipers of God. That's not the case. So that's not at all what we see happening here in any way, shape, or form. Yes?
Okay, this is kind of touching on my comment earlier. So I'm curious, when they were taken captive, do we know history or Bible? I don't know that there's genealogy in the Bible that explains who their parents were.
Right.
Is there?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. So, history-wise, do we know who their parents were? And by the time they were taken captive, I'm guessing that the parents would probably have been killed.
Not necessarily killed. They could have been taken captive, but they would have been nowhere near them.
They would not.
Yeah.
If they were alive, they would not.
Right.
Near them.
If they were alive, because the king's servants would have been kept completely secluded.
And these 4 were probably, well, we would say teenage years.
Oh, yeah.
So this is speaking to what I was saying before. Parents, especially if they were, I am curious if you could do some digging to find out who their parents were. If we know if they were godly, what Old Testament would call righteous people.
I'm sure they would have been because of their knowledge and because of their desire to honor God. I'm sure they would have been.
So I'm just curious as a parent myself, these Daniel's parents, I'm guessing, were praying mightily hard all the time for their son.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, like you said, if they were alive, I'm sure.
Well,
But even if they weren't, I'm sure they still were.
Sure that they
Absolutely.
were praying, because this,
Much like Amram and Jochebed did, actually, for Moses.
well, God can pick and choose, who He wants to bless, and there is a real correlation between parents praying for their children.
Absolutely.
And God overcoming whatever worldly influences when their kids go straying or go testing.
But now remember, these 4 never strayed.
No, that's
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. They didn't, but they were still under very different influences.
Exactly right.
Daniel, like most of the rest of them, were of the royal,
Of the aristocracy, we would
of
call
the
it.
aristocracy. And later, when he does a high priestly prayer for all his people, once again, that would not be the role that a commoner
Exactly.
would take. And so, although it's not a given, it's a pretty sure bet that he was of the royal house.
Well, and the Bible even says that. Take some from basically of the royal family or royalty. Absolutely.
And so probably his parents were not on the scene.
Right. It's very possible. Well, now also remember this. So I bring this up. Let me touch one point. Daniel serves serves all the way through the rule, not all the way, but serves into the rule of Cyrus the Great. Now let me go ahead and, so this is how we can know about their age. Babylon lasts 70 years. They're taken in, trained for 3 years. He serves the Babylonian kings for 70 years, and it actually lives into the years of Cyrus the Great. So he would have been in his 80s when he died, as it would have been Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we don't really hear much more of them until, after the fiery furnace. We don't hear much more of them. But the idea is, understand, that's why we know they had to be teenage at least, maybe even 11 or 12. Because to live 70 years and then into Cyrus the Great as well, that's a long life. So, which that takes me right here. This is what the Medo-Persian Empire looked like. And I put it up so you can see Media, which by the way, you got like the light brown there. And then in each of the other areas, so it starts off as Persia, right by the Persian Gulf. And then they conquer Media, or Media, some say Media, some say Media. Anyhow, nonetheless, they conquer that area. And then all the other shades, it gives you the time that they conquer. And I know it's small, and I'm sorry about that. But this is what the Persian Empire, because the Medo-Persian Empire only is called the Medo-Persian Empire briefly. Because when Persia first takes over Media, they join together, but really all it is was they were thrown in the bone. And because this is what eventually it becomes, the Persian Empire. And that's what we know the most about, which you can see, one area, but right where it stops is right up by the churches of Asia Minor in Ionia, which if you look over and see the word Greece, right to the right of it, it says Ionia, going up and down that coast. And that's where the Persian Empire pretty much stops, except for the major battles constantly trying to take Greece. Because they really wanted to conquer Greece. Why? Alexander the Great had conquered all of Persia. And so this was payback time. Cyrus the Great tried to go over there and got beat really bad. Recalled back and never went again. Xerxes, when he becomes king, wants to avenge his father. And so he goes after him. We know about the great battle of Marathon. We also know about the great battle of Thermopylae. Thermopylae is where the Spartan 300 were. So they constantly tried to take Greece. Before the Persian Empire eventually dies off, they never took Greece. And Greece, it was not a country. There was only city-states. And the two city-states, Athens and Sparta. That was it. And they defeated didn't defeat them, but they stopped that entire empire from taking over their areas. It's pretty amazing. What was the difference there? Well, it wasn't God, but it was freedom, because they were the only people that actually had a democracy. Now, the reason why I say that, and it may sound a little bit odd that I say that, because you can look and see where it's talking about the 400s BC when this is actually going on. I think because God was already setting the stage for the Western world and democracy, because that's what true people of God are free. They're free. They're not under the oppression of anybody. But we'll leave that there and get into that some other time. Any questions or comments at all as we wrap up chapter 1?